Hello everybody, welcome. I'm thinking about a quote that I'll include notes for in the posting of this video. And it's a long and complex quote by a brilliant scholar of ancient languages. And it begins by saying two quotes I remind myself of every single day. And I'll paraphrase slightly. The map is not the territory. This is a very complex idea, but it's a simple metaphor of the. It tells us that there isn't one-to-one correspondence between models, concepts, categories, and reality, or the world as it is. And I don't mean the world as it is without us, because that's not a reasonable thing to wonder about. There's no instance of anything like that in our experience, although some might argue deep sleep, or perhaps awakening. But the idea is that there's the blatant truth, it seems, is that there can't be a one-to-one correspondence between our models and that which is. All events, phenomenon, situations, beings, minds, moments, transactions, tribulations. So the models are conveniences, and we are prone to forget this. To continue with the quote, all models are wrong. Let that sink in for a moment. The very smart people will think, yes, but that's a model, so there's a paradox. If you take it to that order of reference, there is. But it's saying the same thing. Our ideas, explanations, descriptions, analyses, all of these things are a peculiar form of thought activity plus recording plus testing, plus minds themselves. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. And this has an illuminating effect on one of the central ideas that we depend on in common thinking, the idea of a fact. By the time we say something is a fact, we mean this model is true. Right? It's concretely true. One might say the fact of my weight on the earth, the fact of the feeling on the bottom of my feet. Those are slightly less representational facts than the idea that 1 + 1 = 2 or two parallel lines never meet. Now, as it turns out, there's a problem in this mess with context. So that models arise and work within contexts, and the contexts have something that resembles axioms, assumptions underneath them. And we form these contexts for all kinds of crazy human thinking reasons, and making reasons, and selling and buying reasons, and praising and punishing reasons, and all of these kinds of reasons. We make lots of these models and concepts and categories. But they're not the world. And with different categories, with categories that were even slightly more trustworthy, our minds would be relieved of an implacable burden. The burden of accounting for all the actual known inconsistencies between all the models and the things they point at. Now, in his quote, he goes on to say, that when we confuse our models with the real, with identity, with meaning, with value, with moral senses and physical senses, when we confuse the models with the things we use them to point at and talk about, then we will believe that the models are true. And in that case, the world becomes terribly distorted, and a very tiny neighborhood of what it might otherwise have been. And then he goes on to say that the models are useful within the contexts they're appropriate to. This is very important. It introduces the idea that facts have scope. The facts of arithmetic work within the scope of the axioms of arithmetic, and so too geometry. But they are not perfectly true, and they are not, as Gödel's incompleteness theorems propose, they can't be set on an absolutely reliable, structured logical foundation, ever. This is because, partly probably because subsystems can't encompass themselves. Right? Under certain conditions anyway, subfeatures of cognition can't encompass themselves. They can't leap up another order to the order beyond theirs. And the same is true of facts. And some facts, which are certainly true in a system we've developed, like geometry. The fact, for example, that parallel lines never meet, that's an axiom, it's an assumption. And when that assumption, when we look at it from another perspective, the perspective of Riemannian geometry, we find that all parallel lines meet other lines, at least, and maybe all of them meet. I'm not an expert on this form of geometry. So, facts have a necessary array of limitations, not just a single limitation. Their factfulness is dependent on many assumptions. And those assumptions are native to the context in which those facts function, somehow well enough either to be compelling enough to our imaginations or our desires, or to be concise enough to fulfill the necessities of molecular biology and particle physics and things like this. Apparently, the idea that a theory was factual, or the confusion of theory with fact, is not very old. At least the implications of a useful reading of the Greek word, I think it's theoria, it does not imply a fact at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It implies a useful perspective. Remember the second part of the quote where he said, some models are useful. And I think humans are inclined to confuse usefulness with authoritativeness. The fact that it works means it's truth. You know, you turn the key in the engine or hit your car fob and the engine starts. It actually happens. So that seems true. Of course, there are different kinds of facts. That low level, I would call it kind of fact, the fact of when I unlock the door, I can open it. Those are a different kind of truth than theories and models. Though they are concepts, right? We do have concepts so that we can speak about them and determine whether or not our thinking is useful or dangerous or insightful. So there's an urge toward turning everything to utility. And the facts are utilitarian within their natural contexts, but those contexts have very limited scope, and we are not trained to recognize or apply this scope, most of us. If we're philosophers or linguists, we may have some training. Some people may have an intuition but be incapable of formulating it in their consciousness. He goes on to say that when we use these maps and models predictively or prescriptively, catastrophe ensues. This is a paraphrase, but very bad things happen. Once we've taken the models for true presentations of meaning, identity, and value, and so on, the tree is just a tree. Once we've made that fundamental error, if we then use the results to predict future situations, or prescriptively to attempt in some way to address them, or nullify them, or enhance them, this stuff is bound to go sideways because we're in a dream of representations we've lost touch with. Both the vast incompleteness of our models and that which is unknowable, that which might be experienceable but can't be held in representations of thought or language. And most of what's going on fits in there. So if we throw that away, we also throw out the transformational quality of relation as human beings and living beings and perhaps beings with souls. When we encounter phenomenon and phenomenon and beings encounter us, we transform each other dramatically all the time. It's what every living thing is doing, and probably most of the non-living things are doing this as well. Perhaps not in the same way. So the opportunity space collapses, right? It collapses to the declarations of our models. And this is natural for most modern human beings. In fact, it's natural for me. I can occasionally step up a layer and look down on the processes and see, I have taken the models to be true. Now back to the Greek word theoria. The term implied something like a way of looking at some phenomenon or concern or situation and producing perspectives that were useful, but it was irrelevant whether or not they were true. In other words, they were never taken as true. And so you could have 3 or 5 perspectives, some of which conflict, without any problem at all. And this is the idea that has been so compelling to me for many years. That we can play with perspectives like lenses that transform what we see, focusing on some things, blurring others, bringing forth unseen depth and novelty and intelligence and understanding. Something like bifocals for the mind, but you'd need quite a number of different lenses, wouldn't we? Yet we don't have to have physical lenses. Our minds are malleable. We have the capacity to learn things that to previous generations were impossible, and so too the capacity to forget them, to forget things that were fundamental to the nature of our spirit as human beings. So, the old theories were perspectives that highlight something we found useful, meaningful, things that we could operationalize in war or technology or mathematics or science or perhaps even mysticism. As if the humans were exploring a vast dimension inside nature, in their own cognition and relationship with the universe, but particularly Earth and each other. And that space is filled with models. The author I'm quoting, who I can't name here, or actually I probably could. I'll just have to pause for a moment. I can pull this off. His name is Dan McClellan, and you can find him on TikTok. I think that's LLAN. He goes on to say that when our species, or modern people, or people in general, or someone particular is doing this, and most of us I think are doing mostly this, it's because we're, again I'm paraphrasing somewhat, we're rejecting the possibility of understanding for the low-hanging fruit of curating our position on what something is, who it is, where it is, why it is, how it is, which it is, the fundamental question things. So instead of attempting to reach for new understanding, we're clinging to held positions that result from crystallizing the models that we have, or that we form. And some of them are just inherited, right? The categories, you basically inherit that. If you invent outside of it, you're probably going to be a genius, or look that way to regular humans. But the basic categories, those are givens, and they're missing very important elements without which we are unfortunately much more inclined to collapse our minds into the models and descriptions and words and language and so on. And so in our minds, the profound beauty and dimensionality of the actual way things are outside of our models mostly just bounces off of us. It's as if we've become a template that filters, 80% of what we might intelligently experience off as its first few moves. So then we are left isolated in a world of dead objects. The cement, the neighborhood, the house, the car, the smartphone, the garbage cans. And even when we see the trees or the bushes in their little boxes or, rectangular frames, and take pictures of them or whatever we do, there's nothing there. We're not having the experience of being present in and as our human selves, our animal selves. The potentials of our intelligence have largely been prohibited by this kind of activity. And it turns out this kind of activity is extremely successful and contagious in human populations. It's almost all of what's going on. From one perspective on the map. From another perspective, there are astonishing lighthouses of awareness and intelligence within the broad topology of our species at this moment. And similarly throughout time, there are examples of humans recovering some of the possibilities that are so often this way precluded. So, when I think about facts, I don't resist their facticity, but I recognize that their scope is limited to the context from which they emerge, and that there are different kinds of facts. The physical facts seem to form something much less theoretical than ideological facts or modeling facts or even mathematical facts. So there are different kinds. But each type of fact, if I say, so here's an example of someone taking the model to be true. If I pick some particular branch of category of humans, let's say it's probably pretty common to think, and reasonably so, that adults will see children as being naive. Similarly, however, children will see adults as being crystallized, meaning frozen in an array of very confusing behaviors. So those are generalizations. And they're true with the axioms that go with them, the assumptions I'm making, but they're really very abstract. We're not talking about an actual person or situation. We're talking about an idea. And many other useful ideas could be introduced. There's nothing particularly, there's nothing overwhelmingly compelling about this one. So I'll admit the perspective, but I don't reify it into a fact. And I can have other perspectives too. And hopefully I will. Right? I'm trying to illustrate that if we're aware of the context in which a fact, from which it emerges and in which it is presented and in which it's meaningful, then we're less inclined to make wildly unjustified generalizations. Usually or often universal generalizations, right? And this is when the fact escapes its proper scope. And we promote it to the idea of truth. It is true. Now, the idea of truth is complex. I'm not going to dissect it here. But for most of human history, there weren't any models that were promoted as being factual, it appears. They were understood to be partial encapsulations of something. And we make the opposite mistake. Instead of seeing facts as partial encapsulations, we see them as successful, true encapsulations. Part of the problem with Galileo's theory wasn't necessarily that the planets orbit the sun, but rather that this was true, that it was a fact. And that perspective or way of using thought and language threatened the bastions of the axiomatically presumed omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence of God. Now, there was a kind of truth that could compete against that. Though why it would have to compete against it is certainly beyond me, or why the humans play it that way, also mostly beyond me. I have some models of it. So facts are local to context, and they have very narrow scope. Their usefulness is narrowed to the scope from which they emerge and to which they apply. And they are toys. Though we could think of them as tools, I prefer that we play with them rather than take them terribly seriously, though obviously there are some we should take pretty seriously. Again, it's a continuum of meaning. And what's the right word? A continuum of what compels us. We might know, we feel, we have a model of the Earth as some kind of spheroid, oblong, something or other. And the model is reasonably true given the axioms and perspectives from which we're looking at it. But certainly it is also true that you could form a perspective from which the Earth looks flat from space. Right? It wouldn't necessarily look like a sphere. There's different ways of looking at it, and if we change our perspective in dimensionality, we might find that there are useful things to understand from pretending that the Earth might be flat. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the best model. My point is, if we can play with perspective openly, with less concern about its facticity, then we can learn all kinds of astonishing things from angles of thought and curiosity and wonder that are ordinarily mostly off limits to most of us most of the time, I think. And that was a three-phase sequential generalization. I should be penalized for that. The skies of our minds are filled with the artifacts of vastly outmoded categories and ideas and maps and models. And the vast weight of that is dragging us down as a species. We are not trained to use these things, to understand their forms, their activity, how we can relate with them intelligently, which is truly the art of relating with one's own mind intelligently. I don't think the mind is like a computer program, but it's useful to think that it has modules, and the modules are swappable. We can put different modules in there, better ones, better vigilance module, better threat sentinel, better opportunist module, better imagineer module. But even if then this is just a toy, right? I'm saying I think this is part of what we strive to do if we're hungry to learn throughout our lives. We chase insight. And the deep questions, we admit the answers that the humans propose, and some of them seem very deeply factual, right? Very deeply true, at least in the physical sense. And we live in the constructs that emerge from these models. We live in societies that emerge from these models, in cultures that somewhat resist sometimes and somewhat fall under the sway of the structured habits of our ancestors and peers. We must be free to play with ideas without having to only concern ourselves with whether or not they are true, or the best ideas. And certainly there's no best idea. There's the opportunity space and the minds and how they relate with it and the choices they make, and something of impossibility and mystery and incompleteness and all of this. Scope. Understanding the reasonable or useful scope of authorizing ideas and concepts might be the core skill I've been circling in this talk. Because the scope is so limited that if we're stuck there, if that's what draws us to thought and behavior and declaration and analysis, then the birds of our minds are crawling in something sticky. Those inheritances we've acquired from our ancestors and assembled during our lifetimes with our peers, those are supposed to be helpful, not lethal. They're not supposed to make us forget everything. The purpose of those is to be authentically helpful and useful. Once they become gods, once our minds collapse into the models and categories and words, there's no oxygen in there for there's no inspiration. It's not habitable terrain. One small set of faculties in one aspect of our minds prospers here. And when it prospers in this way, it becomes miserable anyway, because it's divided from all the other faculties. And it's the faculty that has affinities for representational thought and representations themselves and artifacts and such. It wants to build things and hold them and grasp them and direct them and control them. Useful faculty, unless it's by itself. So those faculties are part of what draw us into the trap of taking the models and maps to be the world or reality or that which is. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again sometime very soon.